Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the second panel discussion, Global ASEAN and the Evolving Regional Security Architecture. And for those of you distinguished guests who are still at the main foyer, please make your way and proceed to your seat in the ballroom. We are starting now. Thank you very much. So, without further ado, I would like to start our second panel discussion with the topic of Global ASEAN and the Evolving Regional Security Architecture. May I please invite four panelists up on stage, please. The first one, Ambassador Ong Keng Yong, Executive Deputy Chairman, Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Singapore. Please. Mr. Tan Sri Dato Seri Mohammad Johar Hassan, former Chairman and Chief Executive, Institute of Strategic and International Studies, Malaysia, please. The third one, Mr. Koko Klang, Chairman for Strategic and International Studies, Myanmar. And the last panelist for this session, Professor Lu Jieren, Chief Research Fellow, China ASEAN Research Institute, Guangxi University, China. And also, our moderator for this session will also be the same, Associate Professor Chaichana Inkawat, as Faculty of Political Science, Rangkampeng University, Thailand. Would you please be our moderator for this session? Please, sir.
So we'll begin the second session, which I have to strict in terms of time. So we'll begin with Ambassador Ong Keng Yong. He will speak, in terms of evolving regional security architecture. So would you please go ahead and time is about 10-15 minutes in between, and I'm sorry that I have to, strict in terms of time. Please go ahead. Thank you, and say it.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you to the Center for ASEAN Study at Thammasat University for this invitation to visit Bangkok and to exchange views with all of you regarding the development in ASEAN. I have some slides, and they are basically just to help us to focus on the subject that I am touching on. I want to start off by reminding all of us these milestones in ASEAN. The reason for these development, the Bangkok Declaration, ASEAN Vision, and so on, is that at each stage of the development of ASEAN, there have been regional and global developments that require ASEAN leaders to take action. Bangkok Declaration, the 5 founding countries of ASEAN came together because at that time there was an intense rivalry between the East and the West Bloc. Soviet Union was there. The struggle between the ideological powers in the US, in Soviet Union, in China. And basically Southeast Asia was used like a playground or a place where all these proxies of the big powers at that time play with their own respective interests. Then we proceed on after the Vietnam War to the development of ASEAN as an organization. And along the way, whatever the regional and international developments come into play, leading to specific action on the part of the ASEAN leaders. So we have Bali Concord number 2 in 2003, which is actually the beginning of the ASEAN community building. And the Cebu Declaration in 2007 basically bring the vision of 2020 closer to our lifetime. The leaders decided to have the ASEAN community activated by 2015. And then when we have the ASEAN Charter in 2008, it's basically because as ASEAN developed into a credible regional organization, the countries around the world, the other centers of economic and political activities would like to see ASEAN as an institution of certain prominent and permanent arrangements. So we discussed among ourselves, and finally we went ahead to do the ASEAN Charter, which took over from the Bangkok Declaration. So as you can see, it was almost 45 years later that we have the 3-page Bangkok Declaration translated into an ASEAN Charter, which served as a kind of constitutional document for the grouping. But the reason for that, the development of the Charter, was also because of regional and international developments. And then we have the ASEAN Community declared at the end of last year. And now we are in business as an ASEAN Community, and various measures have continued to be implemented. And this will go on until 2025, at least in the current vision document that the ASEAN leaders have. Conclusion, everything that happened in ASEAN is mostly decided by what happens around ASEAN countries, the regional and international development. Now we are a very prominent intergovernmental body. Remember this, intergovernmental. We are not like the EU, which is having its supranational powers executed by the European Commission in Brussels. We are still 10 different countries, and we have to meet very often, almost every day, at all levels, to come to some common ground for us to move the ASEAN agenda forward. This is very different from the European experience, where Brussels decide on something and all the member states of the EU have to implement the decision. And that is why I say what is Brexit is not going to happen anywhere else in the world, because Brexit is a peculiar development based on the propaganda perpetrated by people in Britain, in the UK, to distinguish the UK from the rest of Europe. And they feel unhappy about it because of the so-called supranational provision of the European Union. Bear in mind too that we are actually a sizable market. Yeah, many of the investors from all over the world have come because ASEAN has 630 million people and growing, and continue to be a high potential market for all kinds of products and services. And that's the reason why the more we integrate under the ASEAN Economic Community, the more attractive ASEAN will be to the international investors, and FDI will continue to flow in, right? So if you look at the effort made by the ASEAN leaders through the years, we are actually very much focused on what the international situation impact, how the international situation impact on ASEAN, and what we should do to stay in the business of having an integrated group and riding on the activities that have happened elsewhere in the globe. My next slide basically show you how ASEAN has evolved over the years from 10 different countries into a rather significant group involved in international trade. And in the past few years, in spite of some slowdown in some sectors, we have basically achieved quite a good state of involvement in the international marketplace. This morning you heard a brilliant speech by Mr. Surya Chindawanse, and he talks about ASEAN in the global arena. Actually, we are increasingly brought to the international arena through things like ASEAN chair going for certain important meeting. One of them is the G20 meeting. Every time when the G20 meet, there is always a special invitation for the ASEAN chair country to represent ASEAN. And we have engaged 10 dialogue partners and 17 other countries. These 17 other countries basically are participants in the ASEAN Regional Forum. So together with 10 from ASEAN, we have a 27 member forum which meet every year to talk about the ASEAN and international development. So let me remind every one of us that we have the ASEAN Charter, and in the ASEAN Charter, some of the key elements are listed here in these slides. Everything to do with peace, security, stability, and along the way we have issues of sovereignty, territorial integrity, democracy, rule of law, good governance. All these are principles enshrined in the ASEAN Charter. The Charter has become a bit dated. We hope that in the next year or two, there will be a serious effort to update the provision in the Charter. But for now, all these elements are there. And you notice that at the last bullet, we have even emphasized strongly in the Charter the centrality and the proactive role of ASEAN in regional architecture. But bear in mind, the regional architecture envisaged by our leaders in the ASEAN Charter is open, transparent, and inclusive. In other words, what the leaders are saying is that ASEAN remain friendly with all big powers, all major powers, all powers, in fact, which is interested in having a good relation with ASEAN and want to do business in Southeast Asia. Yeah? So it is in the Charter that we stated very clearly it will be open and inclusive. So those are the key points I thought I should put across to all of you here. I'd like to just make 2 or 3 other additional comments, Mr. Moderator. One is that no matter what ASEAN tries to do, it cannot divorce itself from what is happening in the rest of the world. And we should not divorce ourselves because, as I have illustrated in the few slides that I presented, ASEAN has grown, ASEAN has developed itself as an organization based on what happened in the rest of the world. And we must continue to get engaged. But the important thing is that as we engage the other countries from outside Southeast Asia, especially the major powers, we have to do it in a balanced manner so that ASEAN interests at the end will be preserved. So in this respect, my second point is that ASEAN countries have to understand how to put on the kind of hat that you wear whenever the situation requires it. Basically, each ASEAN country wear 2 hats. One hat is about Thailand and Thailand's position in ASEAN, Thailand's interest in ASEAN, or Singapore's interest in ASEAN. Yeah? But the second hat that we wear is together as a member of this grouping called ASEAN. So if other country wishes to want something done at ASEAN, all of us as 10 should come together and say, is it to the benefit of ASEAN? So the first hat is the national hat, the second hat is the ASEAN hat. So for example, in the last ASEAN summit in Laos, and before that in Myanmar, the chair of ASEAN, Laos, and the chair of ASEAN in 2015, Myanmar, they have emphasized that in their role as chair, they have to do certain things, act in certain way, because they, as chair of ASEAN, has to preserve the interests of ASEAN. Yeah? And in their discussion with the big powers, with the other countries outside of ASEAN, they have maintained this line that I am the chair of ASEAN and I work for the interests of ASEAN, not for the interests of Laos or for the interests of Myanmar per se. So going forward, it is important to recognize that whatever we do as ASEAN, it is part of the ASEAN agenda and the well-being of ASEAN. And in this respect, what I have shown you just now about the principles of the ASEAN as a group, as enunciated in the Charter, have all become very, very much more important. And you have heard just now about the development in the region, the Chinese growth, the rise of China, the way the United States and other European powers responded to all this development, basically it shows that ASEAN must be clever enough to exercise this double hatting function. Otherwise, we will be caught with a difficult situation. Whatever it is, ASEAN agenda requires us to be open and inclusive, and we should try to maintain that characteristic. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ong Ken Yong. I think you gave us at least a perspective for the ASEAN, not today's, but in the future also, especially if we get together and understanding each other. So it means that ASEAN can go on and on. So he gave us something about Brexit in Europe, and that's one of the lessons in which we have to learn. And this is one of the things that challenging the future of the ASEAN. So Ambassador Ong Ken Yong have gave us lots of insights about this. And second panelist, I will go to Mr. Johar. Please give your perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? It's okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank Kun Prapat, Thammasat University for having me here and to be part of this distinguished panel. My presentation will more or less complement what Ambassador Ong Ken Yong presented just now, and also supplement a little bit, perhaps, of what has been said in the previous session. My paper is, of course, on ASEAN and the evolving regional security architecture. Actually, I sent a paper yesterday morning, but I think, well, it'll come soon. In that paper, I talk a little bit about the architecture that prevails in the region. I talk next about ASEAN's challenges. Then I talk about some things we could do, perhaps, in order to promote ASEAN's contribution and effectiveness to the Asia-Pacific region. So on the architecture, I think I'll just say a few brief words. I think we all know what the architecture is. What we have now is a mosaic of interlocking as well as discrete, track one, regional, sub-regional, bilateral, purpose-driven. By what I mean by purpose-driven is, for instance, six-party talks that's directed at the nuclear problem in the Korean Peninsula, and functional cooperation networks, as well as numerous, besides the track 1, track 1.5, track 2, and track 3 processes. And in many of these architecture, what we call the security architecture, actually security is only one facet of a broader agenda. For ASEAN is a good example for this. ASEAN is not just about security, it's about so many other things, not least and perhaps to some extent the most important, the economic agenda. In my paper, I describe a little bit about these processes and architecture, but I'll skip that for our presentation. I'll go to the challenges confronting ASEAN. I think we heard quite a bit of it this morning, and just now Ambassador Ong also touched on some of them. I would just say something. I would say that ASEAN's achievements have been nothing less than spectacular. Nothing less than spectacular, taking into consideration the fact that it is a grouping of 10 mostly developing countries, none of them major powers. Most of them, all but one, gained their independence in the last, 60, 70 years. Many of them in the HDI index as the developing countries, etc., not doing, not very high up. And yet, this grouping has been able to do many astounding things for me. Among them, it introduced a new regional order in Southeast Asia. I think that's quite important. from countries which just became independent in different configurations, political configurations. Countries that were at conflict with one another, and that were subject to so much major power occupation, and some of these powers were not even major. We had the Dutch and so on, So, it's quite a remarkable achievement for these countries to emerge from that kind of background to anchor an organization like ASEAN, which introduced a new regional order in Southeast Asia, and may I say, beyond. No other regional process or organization in the world, even the EU, has been able to manage what ASEAN has done, which is to anchor cooperative political and security processes based on ASEAN norms and principles in a wider Asia-Pacific region that not only includes small states, in fact, it includes big, major powers. All the major powers in the world are included in this Asia-Pacific network, which is anchored by ASEAN, this grouping of 10 states. Now, I think this is a very impressive accomplishment which we should take note of. Now, also on the South China Sea, ASEAN has been able, I think, to interlocute, to engage with China, reasonably successful on the DOC as well as now on the COC. I think these are things ASEAN has managed to do. On the other hand, of course, ASEAN has quite a number of shortcomings. Its strengths are sometimes its weaknesses, and we all know. For instance, this consensus principle, which is good, we act in unison, but at the same time, it slows us down, lowest common denominating factor, etc. And then, of course, in the interest of harmony, good relations, etc., we are very hesitant in interfering, which is very important. The principle of non-intervention is extremely important. But sometimes quite serious things happen within our respective countries, and yet ASEAN finds it slightly difficult to get in, to play a role. And then, to me, ASEAN is in the habit of producing short-term. No, for me, vision statements should be generational. 30 years, something like that. But we are in the habit of, having 10-year vision statements. That's more like operating principles for 5-year plans or annual plans. So these are some things, and we also, our implementation record is not very good. We have tried to improve it of late by having so-called success indicators for everything that we have in our blueprints. But sometimes these success indicators are also very simple to accomplish, very easy. For instance, for political, democratic ASEAN, one of the success indicators is having 2 meetings per day on this, or per year on this subject. So you have 2 meetings per year on this subject, you put a tick, you have accomplished it. So that's not, to me, a very good measure of your performance. But nevertheless, you have to have some measure, and that's it. And you have to be very sensitive about all these things. It's not so easy, for the policymakers.